G'day legends, I hope that you are having a fantastic day and so far you are having a brilliant week also. Now legends, of course, as always, we have a lot to go over. Of course, we will be looking at the maps and we will be comparing maps to see where on the battlefield things are moving. We also need to talk about comments that Trump has made about Zelensky, about Ukraine, about air defense systems, and then we'll be looking at that relationship. We know that relationship is very strained. We need to talk about how Zelensky is confronting this and how Trump is and what the future there may actually be. We need to talk about Europe's energy and their gas and how high the energy prices has gone, with now some executives saying that we need to move back to Russian gas. So we'll talk about that, and we'll talk about then sovereignty over energy, as of course we've seen the US, who now Europe is very reliant on for LNG, then sanction Europe. If you hear a lot of noise, they're doing a little bit of roadworks near myself. We need to do a follow-up on, of course, that horrific missile strike that killed many civilians in Sumy. But we have a little bit more information trickling through. Not that you will see it reported on the mainstream or many other places. And we'll talk about attritional warfare, which I'm guessing is the clickbaity title of this video. But I want to start here. Now, this Mr. Douglas Murray and Mr. Dave Smith interview, I don't need to tell you about it. If you're on Twitter or anywhere, you have seen many parts of it. And it is interesting if you can look past some of the more bravado that Douglas comes to this as, or elitist. But he does talk about one thing, which I want to push back on a lot here, is when he's talking about Ukraine and online then algorithms, he suggests that pro-Russian narratives are pushed far more than pro-Ukrainian narratives. Now, I would say that is incorrect from all of my experience online. And I believe incorrect if you go and see the view counts between who's pro-Ukraine, pro-Russia, and then the neutral of us who try and sit in the middle, where those views actually sit, especially on Ukraine. There's been mass bannings of anything that leans too far one way. And as I say very often, I can show Ukrainian footage. You can see thumbnails on many popular YouTubers of Russian soldiers about to be struck or being struck by drones, but you can't show that in reverse. And if you just look at the views, I think it tells us a lot about that. But this interview, it's been a bit of a catastrophe for Mr. Murray, but it's worth going and having a listen, because it's a good, I guess, almost representation between mainstream and independence. So let's talk about attrition, and this is where I want to start on this video. Now, I copped a lot of flack for sharing these figures, but people missed the point. The point I'm trying to present here is, even at the most extreme numbers, that the attritional war is not being won by Ukraine. I don't care what other YouTubers say and what other metrics that are wanting to get pulled out that sit on the very periphery fringes. When we're talking attritional warfare in a protracted ground war like this, we are looking at men, and men on the front line. Now, I'm not saying that other metrics don't matter, but if you want to point at this metric of this item, you need a person to be in that. So what I'm presenting is the most extreme numbers, knowing that these numbers are very deflated or inflated. So Zelensky did a 60-minute interview with CBS, I believe, own 60 Minutes, but he says in this that up to 100,000 Ukrainian soldiers have tragically died, and the amount of people that have died in this war is just absolutely horrific. But this is a very steep climb from the 40,000 that he said only a few months ago. Now, this figure is very likely low. It makes sense that it would be low at time of war. And it's also very likely not including the 56,000 missing in action from UA losses. But if we use this figure and then we use Ukraine's own figure of Russian losses, which is, as we have stated for years now, very likely very inflated, at approximately 933,000. So again, I'm showing you the very extremes here to still prove my point, although it's probably proven far greater, is if we take in modern warfare with modern medicines, KIA around 20%, wounded 70 to 75, MIA 5 to 10%, and these have been really the benchmarks given for this war. And sadly, the more losses you have, law of averages, the closer you'll actually then become. Now, low-end estimate here is if we take into account 15% of Russia's total number that Ukraine is giving us, so again, it could be inflated, likely is, but if we take the low end, they've had 140,000 KIA. The higher end estimate of 25% is 230,000. Again, tragic losses that we have seen these countries with struggling demographics take. So let's go in the middle and go 20%. So you're talking about 186,500 deaths. Now again, these numbers are to show the extreme given likely incorrect numbers. But what I'm showing is even using Zelensky's figure, using the inflated and deflated inflated figures, it shows that Russia is winning the attritional war. Ukraine needs to maintain throughout the war a minimum of 3-1 or realistically 4-1 or greater. And what we are seeing is not only with these figures, if we take this into account, that Russia is winning that attrition. When we look at recruitment figures, that we do see Russia has far easier recruitment at this point in time. Now, it's not just money thrown at people, but of course that helps. But what we see is over 1,000 a day being recruited. And when we looked at Ukraine's 18 to 25 campaign to try and recruit, talking about, we've had 500, it's just not meeting those replacement rates at the moment. So what my point is here, even using the figures of which will be the most pro-Ukraine figures still proves our point. Okay? Zelensky further in the interview actually more confirms our point, because he says Putin's troops, they occupy 20% along the front, which is largely frozen. Okay, the majority of the front is frozen, but a lot of it is moving. But it's estimated as many as 200,000 Russian troops have been killed. So at best here, Zelensky is giving a 2-1, which still given the population differences as well as the recruitment differences, definitely is not winning the attritional war at this point in time, which is very, very important given where we may see this war move and negotiations with, of course, Trump. Now, the question after this is, when President Trump called you a dictator, said that Ukraine started this war, what did you think? And of course, Trump has said this actually on multiple occasions, and the tweet was about being a dictator. Zelensky said, I believe, sadly, Russian narratives are prevailing in the US. How is it possible to witness our losses and our suffering, to understand what the Russians are doing and still believe that they are not the aggressors and they did not start this war? This speaks to the enormous influence of Russia's informational policy on America, US politics, and US politicians. So saying that Russian narratives, they are prevailing in the higher echelon in the political sphere in Washington. Now, one thing we have seen in this is Trump has warned Zelensky before not to be dipping his toe in US affairs and telling him how to think. What we may see is Zelensky just might be done with the US and knowing that the US is going to walk away and not mind straining that relationship more. Now, from a perspective of diplomacy and trying to get the best end to the war, that worries me a lot, because he does go on further in this interview and basically state they need the US, but we have seen real pushback on this suggestion before, but continuing the suggestion that it's Russian informational warfare that is changing how Trump, Vance, and Washington are seeing this. It would be, I know you'll never get this, but it would be great to sit down with Trump or Vance and actually know, like, what do you think of this and what may have changed your mind on this? Why do you believe that it may have been X that has started this? Of course, lots of people have different ideas about expansion or this or that, but I'd like to know what is really driving Mr. Trump's opinion. Now, Trump has pushed back on this interview a lot. Now, in this, it's not specifically about Zelensky, but he just says it how dishonest and how it is basically a political operation disguised as news for 60 minutes. And again, reiterating, as you'll see, that this war would never have happened if the election in 2020, he says, wasn't rigged, that CBS is out of control and they should pay a big price for this. So let's then move on to then the Sumy attack, and then we'll come back around to Trump and Zelensky. Now, of course, we saw that horrible attack where over 30 people, including several children, were killed by Russian missiles. But we did say, and it is being completely ignored, well, there's a lot of information coming out that there may have been a military parade happening. And we went over, where do the laws of armed conflict actually sit? It may not be ethical or moral, it may be disgusting, but where does that sit? And we have today this coming out from Ukrainska Pravda, so Ukrainian media, the commander of the 27th Rocket Artillery Brigade was killed in a Russian missile attack on Sumy. Now, this 27th Rocket Artillery, they are the ones that operate the HIMARS based out of Sumy. This is Colonel Yuria Yula, who was killed here, and this is from the Berdichev City Council. Now, this attack was reported everywhere. I heard it on my local radio yesterday and today, from there all the way to world leaders, but no one is caring to actually share this part of the information of this. Now, again, we see further like this too, of this young gentleman here who was apparently killed or reportedly killed as well. Now, what we spoke about yesterday was we need to talk about the philosophy of actually talking about when do you sign off on strikes, but where does the law then actually sit? And it's very difficult to know because it is all classified and the calculations are done before the missiles then strike. It's done before the fact. Now, Trump has said, he was told that this was a mistake. I don't believe that. I think these missiles are incredibly accurate, 5 to 7 meters, and struck very close to where they were meant to. And I believe the Russian command knew that they were going to have Sivkaz as well. But as we have seen, a commander was killed in that. So let's apply US-Israeli metric to this and see where that lines up. Now, what I'm not doing is I'm not trying to justify this at all. I think every death in this war is horrible, especially children and especially civilians. And I will say they are not being protected enough by everyone involved in this. They're not being protected enough by Russia, including Russian civilians. They're not being protected enough by Ukraine. They're not being protected enough by the US or the EU. But here, like I say, morally firing missiles into densely populated areas is never justified. But if we take a complete legal perspective, we're going to take US and Israelis' reported non-combatant cutoff value. Would this strike be signed off? And what I'm saying is, does Russia probably have a similar non-combatant cutoff value to this? Now, these, as we have said, are classified, but these are different, of course, for higher value targets. So in Iraq war, for HVTs was a 29 to 30. So to strike target here, if you could have a value of no more than 29 or 30, then non-combatants, you could sign off on that strike. For then junior Hamas operators, you're talking 15 to 20, seniors around 100, and in an instance over 300. So that is how I believe, and that pushback on this was an accident. I don't believe that. I think the Russian command went, yep, to strike this guy, we are willing to have X amount of deaths. Absolutely horrible, no justification for it, but also there's no justification for holding a military parade in the middle of a packed city on a day like that when you know that Russia will launch strikes if they get wind of that. There's a lot of people here with blood on their hands, from the commanders signing the strikes, the bomber pilots launching them, to those who more than three is in the war should fucking know better not to be doing that. It's utterly ridiculous and stupid, and I hope Zelensky actually does something about this, because we see this again and again. Now, let's have a look at the maps, and then we'll talk about Trump and Zelensky and Patriot. So, of course, we have Ukraine in the centre of the screen, the capital of Kyiv, the red areas occupied since 22, the purple, of course, since 2014. Now, we're going to turn this on. The red check that you'll see, that is ground that Russia has made over the past 24 hours. But the first place I want to come is into Kursk, and we have seen a shift here around Guevo. Now, what this lines up with is geolocations we've had for about a week, but we can see a substantial reduction in Ukrainian control back into Russia from yesterday to today, around about 10 to 11 square kilometres going off Ukraine's figures. Now, what I haven't done is I haven't actually looked at the grey zone up here yet. No changes here. I am far more interested at this point in time, because I believe it's far more important, what is happening in this sector rather than this sector. A crossing into here, if possible, would really be a ace in the deck of negotiations for where other front lines are sitting, and to counter then if Ukraine occupy any of the territory back into Russia. And as well, it is being reported that Kursk, the city itself, not the oblast, has been under large drone attack. Now, we'll continue moving down the maps and we'll come to Kupiansk, so northeastern corner. No changes shown on this map today, but let's have a look here. This is then the Syriac map. Now, of course, not the easiest to line up, but we'll give you a couple of things to line this up on. During the last 5 days, Russian army increased the pressure at Kupiansk axis, trying to outflank the locality of Stepova Novosilka from the north and the south. So what we need to look at is where this movement is coming out from then Kislivkia, and the easiest way is just to see where this road then kinks up in this dogleg, that it's moving out here in the south. This is Stepova Novosilka, and then basically in line where this road sits, if we draw a line straight up, he's suggesting that the front line is out to approximately here, as well as moving in this corner, trying to outflank that area and then continue on through where there is a lot of open territory towards Kupiansk front. I think there'll be more effort put on the far northern flank of here rather than Kupiansk, as well as in the south near Senkove, more so than in here. Just going off what Russia has done before, trying to envelop things. I know some YouTubers are saying that this is a new tactic they're calling the horseshoe tactic. If someone is suggesting Russia enveloping something is a new tactic, comment that they're an idiot and then move on to somebody else. Now, let's continue our way down the map, and then we get to this front line, which I'll call the Terny front. And what we have seen is over the past few weeks, from Nevsky all the way to Katanivkia, that Russia has not only then created a movement up then the road here, but has expanded that much wider also. And I believe this is trying, this movement here, to put more pressure on up into the north, into this area, because of course the logistics in here since the Pishani front reached the Oskil has become very difficult. But we have seen that this is gaining traction, at least from Syriac maps. Last 4 days, Russian army took control over serious positions southwest of Makivka. In addition, Russian forces approached the locality of Novomyakivka at the south and continue developing the encirclement of Nove from south to north. So this is Nove in here. This is this Novomyakivka. So we see that this movement out then up this road, this is the easiest part to look at, is where this road doglegs. So they're up to this area, and this is the north of Nove, as well as down in here, reaching into the south of Nove, where my cursor is at this moment. So just keep an eye on this front. I believe that could be very important as well. We'll move our way down, and then we'll come to Toretsk. We do see, according to Syriac, Ukraine did recover a piece of ground in here. Sorry, wrong one. Now we'll open it. So during the last 48 hours, Ukrainian army recaptured the industrial plant in the outskirts of the 12th district. On the other hand, Russian army took control over trenches northwest of this area, which I won't try and pronounce. So if we then zoom in on this, this is suggesting just around this sector in here that there are areas coming back under control of then the Ukrainian forces. And then we have to move towards this one, this Ozerenkivka. Yeah, close enough. Then we'll zoom in up here, and just in here that the Russians have made some amount of ground. Then our last update we will have is then down around Velika Novosilka, Rozdolny. We do see red check on this map that the Russians have expanded control out of here in the direction of Rozliv. I believe this realistically looks far different to what this actually is showing at this point in time. And I have one last Syriac maps, apologies. So what we have seen is a lot of changes around Suka-Balka front. Now, what we suggest yesterday was Syriac was behind Deep State, and Syriac has caught up on this today. And then we'll come to then the west of here, this important intersection, and then we will see around in this front line in here, that it has been some areas coming back under control of the Russian forces, or coming under control of those forces. Now, this area in here saying that the Russians have taken full control over this village sitting there. So keep an eye on many different areas of the front line. The one big benefit we get for the maps is, as there's talks of ceasefires, maybe we will see something, and a benefit of that will be, hopefully, we get an idea of where the front line is actually sitting and what mappers have been correct, what are pushing then narratives. Now, of course, we have seen elections take place in Germany. Now Germany is saying that they may be willing, or are willing, to send then the long-awaited Taurus missiles to Ukraine. Of course, these are like the German variant of the Storm Shadow Scalp, which I'm sure you're familiar with, but we don't hear about it much anymore. And I believe that is twofold. I think primarily is to actually produce them. And secondly is, the longer something is in play in the battlefield, the better the defenses against that will become. But again, this is basically 3 years late, and after a lot of Russia's strategic assets have moved outside of the range of these, which sit about 500 kilometres. Again, the production capacity of these is fairly low, and I do wonder the quantity that will actually be delivered to Ukraine. So Trump has said some interesting comments over the last 24 hours about Ukraine. And Zelensky, in that interview with CBS, he did talk about wanting to buy up to 10 Patriot systems from the US. And this is what Trump has pushed back on this.
But that's a war that should have never been allowed to start. And Biden could have stopped it, and Zelensky could have stopped it.
So again, we hear Trump saying a lot that Biden and Zelensky could have stopped this war. And what this is referencing is this idea of moving all your politics towards we wanting to join NATO. Trump will say that then that encouraged Russia to then form military action to move on. The US did have an assessment of this as well. The US did assess back in the day, people don't like to talk about this, but if there is movement into NATO, it is highly likely that Russia may have some form of armed aggression. Now, this doesn't mean that therefore, it's not aggressive and that there hasn't been movement. You couldn't join and you shouldn't look for joining alliances, but that is what Trump is getting at.
And Putin should have never started it.
Also saying that Putin should never have started the conflict.
Everybody's to blame.
Have you spoken to President Zelensky, sir, about his offer to purchase more Patriot missiles?
Sorry, I'll get back to that in a sec, but he says everybody is to blame. And this is something that a lot of people, and Douglas Murray disappointingly did this as well, is they oversimplify the conflict to 2022. And that is done on purpose to paint very clear images. Now, I'm not saying you shouldn't do that for some areas, but if you want to look at the conflict and if you want to go back, it started in 2014, you need to take into account a lot of other different both politics, military actions, and assessments as well. That is what Trump is getting at, which people will paint as a Russian narrative. It may be a Russian talking point, but it's a talking point for a reason, and that's why the administration here is saying this also. Now, the question was asked about more Patriot weapon systems that Zelensky is wanting to purchase.
More Patriot missiles?
Oh, I don't know. He's always looking to purchase missiles. He's against. Listen, when you start a war, you got to know that you can win the war.
So Zelensky's always looking for weapons. Trump doesn't want to deliver them because he doesn't want the war to continue, and saying he is always looking for weapons. And when you start a war, so he's talking about Zelensky here, and of course his predecessor, Biden.
War, right? You don't start a war against somebody that's 20 times your size and then hope that people give you some missiles.
So you don't start a war that is against a country 20 times your size and then hope that you'll get supply of missiles, is what Trump is saying. And we go back to 2019 and that RAND study of extending Russia. I always name it the wrong thing, of extending Russia, and being able to extend Russia and reduce their military capacity. This is what they did talk about, was how does this actually look for Ukraine, and does it create friction in NATO, which we have then seen. Trump has said a few things as well about deadlines, and I gave Putin a deadline for a ceasefire. very good peace proposals coming soon. How this actually looks, we don't know. But I can't see, if Trump expects this to work, given the situation that I'm seeing, and he will have a far better grasp on the actual frontline situation than I, because I don't have Willy satellites fucking orbiting, looking at things. If he expects this to work, I cannot think that it's going to be any less than the 4 oblasts given to Russia, including what isn't occupied, as well as Ukraine never joining NATO in writing. Not just said, but in writing. If he expects it to end at this point, I can't see it being anything other than that. I don't know. We'll see in time. Trump has tweeted, the war between Russia and Ukraine is Biden's war, not mine. I just got here, and for 4 years during my term, I had no problem in preventing it from happening. Putin and everyone else respected your president. I had nothing to do with this war, but I am working diligently to get the death and destruction to stop. Talks about 2020, but Zelensky and crooked Biden did an absolutely horrible job in allowing this travesty to begin. So one of the big things I'll take out of this is from comments Trump has made to statements like this. We are correct in our assessment that Trump wants an end to the war as soon as possible, basically by any means that will still give the US some credibility and then try and draw Russia away from China. That is what we believe, and I believe we're seeing this. He's saying, look, it's Zelensky, he's basically saying he started it, and Biden in this as well. They allowed this to start, and I need to get out of it, and no matter how I get out of it, it's not my fault because I wasn't in power. But the US, and I think he's almost reiterating here, that they do not see this war anymore as their responsibility. And this has been a lot of what sort of Trump's rhetoric in power is that we are not responsible for your defense to Europe. We're not responsible for this war over here and X, Y, and Z all around the world. Instead, we're even going to be tariffing. And tariffs, of course, they've had a worldwide then feeling and impact felt. And this Reuters article today, titled Back to Russian Gas, Trump-weary EU has an energy security dilemma. We raised this exact concern around sovereignty and reliance on the US months ago, and we'll go over some of the bits we talked about back then. But US LNG helped to plug Russia's supply in Europe during the energy crisis. But now Trump has rocked relationships with Europe established after World War II and turned to energy as a bargaining chip in trade negotiations. Businesses are wary that reliance on the US has become another vulnerability. Against this backdrop, executives of major EU firms have begun to say what would have been unthinkable a year ago, that importing some Russian gas, including from Russia's state giant Gazprom, that would require another major policy shift, given that Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022 made the EU pledge to end Russian energy imports by 2027. And this is what we have been talking about in this, that there are 3 pillars of sovereignty: economic, trade, defence, and energy. These factors are foundational to the operation of any state, and as such, if one of them is dominated by another nation who has the ability to threaten to damage your nation by withholding resources, access to markets, or security, then you are, in effect, not a fully sovereign nation, as they can compel you to behave in a desired way. Jump how high. And what we were getting at here was, if you leave parts out of this, at least then the energy, there was not just one country being the US. Defense, very heavily the US, and economic trade, as well as through the USD, and tariffs have affected that also. And this links into what we are speaking about, that let's consider Europe. The argument that Europeans should cut off Russian oil to increase sovereignty, in this case gas, same. Additionally, and equally importantly, they have simultaneously decided to levy every sanction imaginable under the sun on Russia and cut off trade with them. Now, we need to set aside any ideological or moral argument, because of course that comes into account here. But what we are discussing and what Reuters we're looking at is just the question of sovereignty. What has happened now that the US has a less friendly EU government in power. Europe, by doing this, has removed all access to Russian energy and replaced a significant portion with American energy. Doing so has increased America's influence over time. So energy, They've reduced trade with Russia massively, replacing it in part with increased trade with America, among others, again, increasing American influence. This is, of course, before the tariffs came in. Europe has long been dependent on the US for defence. And as such, this now completes the clean sweep of the three pillars of sovereignty: energy, trade, defence. I would argue Europe has manoeuvred itself into a position of being a complete vassal state to the US with either significant or complete dependence on the US. And that pillar of taking away the energy but relying all now on one state, it's fine if you've got a healthy balance or your relations, if it's all in one state, is good. But when something starts getting a bit more difficult, like the US, they can start leading on these and will have a significantly larger impact. The tariffs that America has put on the trade with Europe is having a much larger impact because Europe is very dependent now also on American energy. This becomes a problem when it's just one nation. Europe has limited options. This is back to Reuters. Talks with an LNG giant in Qatar for more gas, they have stalled, and while deployment of renewables has accelerated, the rate is not fast enough to allow the EU to feel secure. This gentleman here, an executive vice president at one of France's gas giants here, has said if there is a reasonable peace in Ukraine, we could go back to flows of 60 billion cubic metres, maybe 70 annually. So this is still below what it used to be. This is state partly owned, among the biggest buyers of Gazprom gas. He said that Russia could supply 20 to 25% of EU needs, down from 40% before the war. The head of French oil major Total Energies has warned Europe against over-reliance on US gas for not only the expense of it, but some of those sovereignty reasons we spoke about and the ability for US to have way more leverage. We need to diversify many routes, not over-rely on one or two. Europe will never go back to importing 150 billion cubic metres from Russia like before the war, but I would bet maybe something like 70 billion cubic metres, so below half. France, which produces a large amount of nuclear power, already has one of the most diversified energy supplies in Europe. Germany relied heavily on cheap Russian gas to help drive its manufacturing sector until the Ukraine war and has fewer options. Of course, they've collapsed a lot of their nuclear plants. Now, this chemical park here, which is home to some of the largest then chemical plants, of course, DOW Chemical and Shell, and some markers say Russian gas should return quickly. Russia used to cover 60% of local needs through the Nord Stream pipeline, which was blown up in 2022. Wonder by who? We are in a severe crisis and can't wait, Managing Director of Intraluna, the operator of this area. He said the German chemical industry has cut jobs for 5 quarters in a row, something not seen for decades, saying reopening pipelines would reduce prices more than the current subsidy programs. It's a taboo topic, saying many colleagues agreed on the need to go back to Russian gas. But you're a brave man if you were to say that publicly. But with all of this, with cutting off that gas, people blowing up the pipeline, Trump's tariffs, with Europe wanting to massively increase its local domestic industry, is it actually possible to compete internationally without access to cheap and reliable energy? Can Rheinmetall compete with Hanwha? Rheinmetall is a German armoured vehicle giant, and Hanwha is a South Korean military giant. Can BMW compete with Kia, Toyota, or Chinese BYD while maintaining the same standard of life in a democratic country? Because what you'll see is if this competition can only be held at the expense of the daily life of the people living here, you will see in democratic countries that voting shift quickly. And we are seeing that, especially in Germany and France. So keep an eye on that. But I don't know at this point, with the more expensive US LNG, and it's become way more expensive with tariffs and everything, can Europe anymore with high wages, high living standards, which are great things, but can they compete industrially anymore? Australia, we can't compete industrially, and we are a gas, coal giant. Of course, different sector of the world. Legends, I hope that you're having a great day, and I'll speak to you tomorrow. Thank you. Bye-bye.